Alright, so we're going to continue with this video um, with a part 2. I assume this will be the last part, but we'll see. Um, on the test of a true prophet. Now, we've already gone over Deuteronomy chapter 13. There's two key chapters on this. Deuteronomy chapter 13 and Deuteronomy chapter 18. And we've seen how in Deuteronomy 13 it talks about the prophet who may actually provide a sign or a wonder or something he tells you that comes to pass. So, however, despite that, he promotes other gods and seduces the children of Israel to serve them. And somewhere here, I think it says, let's see, yeah, let us go in verse 6. Let us go and serve other gods which neither you nor your fathers have known. All right, so these are gods that are unknown to the children of Israel that are being promoted. Never heard of them before, right? Whereas the deity that's identified by capital Lord in the English translation, that's the Hebrew tetragrammaton, Yud, He, Vav, or Wal, He. And, that's a very specific personal name there. So, and then also it says, basically the creator, your God. And God, of course, is a translation of Elohim. So, if the deity is known as Elohim, the children of Israel, they understand that Elohim is the same as Yud, He, Vav, He. And I believe you could see that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, because in these discarded manuscripts, the two terms are interchanged. Like, seems to be a common mistake that these two terms are interchanged, and maybe that's the reason these manuscripts wound up buried in the sides of these ravines or hills or cliff faces or whatever you would call them. I think there's a term that's typically used for the Dead Sea Scrolls manuscripts that are deposited in the side of those cliff faces. There's a term that they use for those cliff faces, but I forgot what it was. Anyway, so these two names would be names for the biblical deity that the children of Israel did recognize. But if you came peddling the name of a deity that was not one of these two, then it was probably a deity that was not someone that the children of Israel had ever heard of. Of course, there's also like El Shaddai, and I think some others, but they're just variants of this biblical deity, the specific one. So it would be like if your beloved wife, you might have, there's her specific legal birth name, but then you may have some pet names for her, right? Names of terms of endearment, names of affection for her. So you understand that if you call her Honey Bunny, you're referring to, say, Rachel, if that's her birth name. Of course, I'm speaking in, like, what, common vernacular? Is that the correct term? I'm speaking as a common person here, and I'm not intending to be disrespectful, and I'm not suggesting that anyone should be disrespectful to the Creator. So, but it's clear that when they're talking about Elohim, they're also talking about the Creator, the Tetragrammaton. So these two terms are synonymous and, again, were used interchangeably. So, however, in the text of the Torah, let's get that straight, you have to use the correct term. Otherwise, you're breaking certain rules, scribal rules, so you have to bury that manuscript because it contains the Creator's divine name, and that's what Jewish law states you have to do with a manuscript with the Creator's name on it. And this is an example of where so-called Messianic Jews and Messianic Gentiles who like to pose as someone who is Jewish, this is an area where they really, really profane the Creator's name, and they use the Creator's name in a worthless way. Like they'll put the divine name, the Tetragrammaton, on a T-shirt, and then go and eat some barbecue, and let it and the stains drip. The barbecue sauce with the pork grease drips down onto the Tetragrammaton, and then they'll throw the T-shirt with the Tetragrammaton on it, into a washing machine with some soiled underwear. This is an example of Jews, less educated Jews, and just your typical Gentiles trying to put on the appearance of being holy, but then engaging in things that are disrespectful to the Creator, to say the least. So anyway, we've passed on Deuteronomy chapter 13. We've covered the case of a prophet who maybe gives a sign or a wonder and it actually happens, or he predicts something and it actually comes to pass, yet he promotes a deity that the children of Israel had not known at this time when Moses was alive and uttering these words that we find in Deuteronomy. In other words, I guarantee there was no child of Israel at that time who had ever heard of anyone named Jesus. Especially considering that there is no hard J sound in Hebrew or Greek, if you want to, refer to the Christian addendum. But in Hebrew, and I believe also in Aramaic, there is no hard J sound. So the name Jesus is an impossibility in that context. It's just not something they would have heard. And yet the Christian addendum says there is no other name under heaven by which man can be saved. Not even the Tetragrammaton apparently. Somehow the name of Jesus superseded and supplanted the personal sacred name of the Creator. This is why I call the so-called New Testament or so-called New Covenant scriptures, even though the Dead Sea Scrolls community considered themselves the New Covenant and they were pro-Torah. That's why I call the Christian addendum, or the so-called New Testament, the Christian addendum, because it's tacking on interpretations and ideas to the Hebrew Tanakh that weren't needed and moreover are contradictory to the Hebrew Tanakh. And I'll demonstrate that even further. Anyway, let's move on with Deuteronomy chapter 18 because I've got some other stuff to cover. So now we're going to be talking about a different case, or a somewhat different case. Let's see, we may have to skip ahead here. I think, yeah, verse 9 is when we can start. Excuse me. When you come into the land which the Creator your God gives you, you shall not learn to follow the abominable, there's that word abominable again, the abominable practices or disgusting practices of those nations, those goyim, those nations, right? Am I right? Is it goyim? Should be goyim. Yes, it's goyim. Right here. Let's see. Ha goyim. So, yeah. We can continue. Verse 10, there shall not be found among you anyone who burns his son or his daughter as an offering, or anyone who practices divination, a soothsayer, or an augur, or a sorcerer, or a charmer, or a medium, or a wizard, or a necromancer, or a 10th level cleric. You know, I just threw that in there because all that sounds like so much Dungeons and Dragons, doesn't it? Anyway, for whoever does these things is a disgusting thing to the Creator, and because of these disgusting practices, the Creator your God is driving them out before you. So all this stuff up here is part of the reason that the Creator is driving these people out of the land of promise and making way for the children of Israel to take that land and dwell in it. So that's how disgusting these things are to the biblical deity, that he would drive a people out of that land and replace them with another people, namely his people, the children of Israel. You shall be blameless before the Creator your God. For these nations which you are about to dispossess give heed to soothsayers and diviners, but as for you, the Creator your God has not allowed you so to do. So, again, you have to understand that the children of Israel are not supposed to do these things. However, the Creator provides a way for the children of Israel to have a line to heaven, a line of communication to heaven, to find out what's going on. The Creator your God will raise up for you a prophet like me, this is Moses speaking, from among you, from your brethren, him you shall heed. Just as you desired of the Creator your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly, when you said, let me not hear again the voice of the Creator my God, or see this great fire any more, lest I die. So, you know, the awesome power of the Creator was was such that it made some of the children of Israel feel like they might die or be consumed by this fire. And the Creator said to me, they have rightly said all that they have spoken. So basically, the children of Israel were asking for an intermediary to act as a buffer between the Creator's awesome power and their human mortal souls, or bodies, I guess you could say, living souls. They must have felt like wicks, like a candle wick that could just get burned up, or like a blade of grass in a wildfire, just totally crisped. And the Creator said to me, they have rightly said all that they have spoken. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers, and I will put my word. So that shows that that these prophets that the Creator will provide, and here Christians tend to interpret this as a single person. I will raise up for them a prophet like you. And they think that that refers to Jesus. But this isn't referring to a single person. This is referring to a provision for the children of Israel as they existed through the centuries. Because if you say that this refers to Jesus, then you're discounting all of the other prophets that came before from Moses to Jesus, as if they weren't actual prophets commissioned by the Creator. Clearly, it's not referring to just one person. He's explaining to them that just like the Gentiles have all these soothsayers and diviners and spiritual mediums and blah blah blah, that Israel will get multiple people through the course of their existence who will provide them this heavenly insider knowledge, if you will. I will raise up a prophet for them. Say it was in a given generation. I will raise up a prophet for them, that generation. A prophet like you from among their brothers. This prophet has to be one of the children of Israel. It can't be a Gentile like Muhammad, or a Gentile like Jesus. Yes, I said it. The the common misconception is that Jesus was a Jew. No, he wasn't. Jesus is a literary disguise for Titus Flavius, the Roman general turned emperor who, with his father Vespasian, exterminated not just Jewish men, but also pregnant Jewish women and children. Not pregnant children, but pregnant, well, I mean, some of them may have been young and pregnant, but you know how that goes with, people who had lived before laws against the age of consent and so forth, right? It happens sometime, but there were also received standards that people had, the accustomed norms of when it was acceptable, right, to get married and have children. But I'm going off on a tangent. So it wasn't Jesus, the Gentile, because this Titus Flavius, he exterminated Jewish men, women, and children down through the Galilee into Judea, finally destroying the temple at Jerusalem, for which he was accused of impiety. And in Flavius Josephus, they try to act like Titus was somehow not truly responsible for the destruction of the temple, that, his soldiers, who it makes clear how disciplined they were in the rest of the war against the Jews, suddenly they were just so inflamed and so undisciplined that Titus just couldn't control them, and they destroyed the temple even though it was against his will. The reason it tries to paint him that way is because he was accused of impiety, which was destroying sacred sites that were in the Roman Empire. It was against Roman law, according to my understanding, to destroy the sacred sites of the cultures that the Roman Empire absorbed. The cultures were supposed to be preserved. So when Titus destroyed the temple, he was subject to the accusation of impiety, but I'm not sure. It looks like he successfully played off that accusation by saying that the soldiers just got uncontrolled. Even though the Christian addendum also makes a point when Jesus supposedly meets the Roman general or Roman officer, and the Roman officer says, yes, if I tell, my subordinates, my soldiers to do this, they do that, and then if I tell them to do that, they do that. And then Jesus is saying, oh, I have not seen such faith in all the children of Israel. Give me a break. That's such pro-Roman bullcrap. Really, your Jewish Messiah is going to say that the Roman armies that would crucify religious Jews and kill Jewish women and children wholesale all through the Holy Land, that they had more faith than the children of Israel. That's what your Jewish Messiah would say. Get real, man. That's obviously pro-Roman propaganda created by Romans. That's why it's in Greek, not in Hebrew. If you wanted the real messianic literature of that time, look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. What language is it in? It's in Hebrew and Aramaic. What? Jews speaking their own language? Writing literature in their own language? Why wouldn't they write it in Greek? Maybe because that's the language of the Gentiles. So, to continue, I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brethren, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. I will put my words in his mouth. He shall speak to them all that I command him. And whoever will not give heed to my words, which he shall speak in my name, I myself will require it of him. So on the one hand, there's a positive commandment. You must heed and obey the words which that prophet that he shall provide to the children of Israel at that particular time, whatever time that is. The positive commandment is you should heed his words, which he will speak in the Creator's name, or the Creator himself will require it of that person. Then there's the negative commandment. But the prophet who presumes to speak a word in my name which I have not commanded him to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that same prophet shall die. And then you have the book of Acts where the Jews seek to kill the so-called Apostle Paul. Like, they had no reason or justification for it, according to the story, that Paul was the saintly hero and it was just the evil Jews who were trying to take him out. When Deuteronomy 18 here says that if someone's a false prophet, you gotta bump him off. And if you say in your heart, how may we know the word which the Lord has not spoken? So that's a valid question. Okay, so how do I know when a prophet's saying something that isn't from you? The answer given is, when a prophet speaks in the name of the Creator, if the word does not come to pass or come true, that is a word which the Creator has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. You need not be afraid of him. In fact, I think other translations may actually say, you shall not be afraid of him. Let's see, Bibles. Thou shalt not be afraid of him. You shall not be afraid of him. He need not be feared. NIV, NIV is not literal. It says, so do not be alarmed. You need not be afraid of him. Do not be afraid of him. You are not to be afraid of him. You shall not be afraid of him. You shall not be afraid of him, so you need not fear him. You need not be afraid of him. Thou shalt not be afraid of him. Be not afraid of him. You shall not be afraid of him, and so forth. Right? So that means if someone comes along and he fits this description, man, you don't have to give him the least bit of respect. Don't fear him. Don't fear what he says, because he predicted something and it didn't come to pass. Now, this leads me to a question where I honestly don't know the answer to the question. And maybe someone more learned than I can provide the answer. And that is that, say prophets have careers, right? They utter multiple prophecies, all right? What if they utter one prophecy and it comes to pass? And then they utter another prophecy and it does not come to pass. And then they utter a prophecy after that and it comes to pass. So if they utter in their career a prophecy that does not come to pass, does that mean you don't have to listen to any of their prophecies after that? Or is it talking about a case by case where on a per prophecy basis, if the prophecy doesn't come to pass, you don't have to be afraid of him? Or is it a case where if they ever utter a prophecy that doesn't come to pass, you never need to be afraid of him after that? Like in anything he says after that, just don't listen to it. I don't know the answer to that question, so I can't presume or pretend as a non-Jew student of the Hebrew Tanakh, I can't advise you on that. That would be a good question for someone more learned than I am. Now, to go back to Deuteronomy 13 again, was that verse 9 or verse 6? Other gods which neither you nor your fathers have known. Acts chapter 17, starting at verse 22. So Paul, standing in the middle of the Areopagus, said, Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, To an unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. And then he twists the whole concept of the unknown God into the unknown God being the God of the Bible. when the Torah explicitly says you shall not listen to anyone who's promoting a God you have not known. If you haven't known the God, then it's an unknown God. It's a God that is unknown to you. And yet, here in Acts chapter 17, right in the face of the Torah, and everybody loves to pretend that Paul was so versed in the Torah, like he was one of the best studied students of Rabban Gamliel, right? And then he comes and has the audacity to risk the reputation of someone promoting an unknown God. That is a very serious issue. Now, the fact that he's speaking to the men of Athens, maybe it's not such an issue because these are Gentiles. Because he goes on to quote a Gentile in Acts chapter 17, verse 28. Or rather, I'm sorry, yeah. In him we live and move and have our being. I think that's a quote of a pagan. I could be wrong. I know that he quotes pagans sometimes. Anyway, but the audience here are Gentiles, so I don't know. Maybe it's not such an issue if you're speaking to Gentiles. But for any Jew listening to Paul, a supposed Jew, teaching that gives credence to the accusations that the Jerusalem church, led by James, or more properly Jacob, it's really Yaakobos, I think, in Greek. It's not James. That's a result of the King James version. It's Jacob. Yaakobos was the name of the leader of the Jerusalem church. Yaakobos the just. In Hebrew, he would be the tzaddik. So this leader of the Jerusalem congregation or church, you can't even say church is the proper word. You'd have to say congregation or assembly or something. He, according to, I think, the book of Acts, or it might be in Galatians, he says that, like it was known throughout the Jewish diaspora, that Paul was teaching against the Torah. Well, I mean, you need look no further than verse 23. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. That is completely against Deuteronomy chapter 13. Although he's trying to put a spin on it in order to promote the deity of the Torah. As if the Torah needs you to put a spin on it like that. Or that you would even want the sort of people who might be attracted to that spin to come closer to the Torah. So, yeah, there's a reason that the so-called Apostle Paul was regarded as a false apostle by the most Torah-based early Christian sects. That's even if the Netzarim and the Evyonim, that's even if they were Christian at all. Because, where was it? A man, where did I see that? A man, I think was it in Acts chapter 17? Yeah, verse 31. Here Paul supposedly says, because he has appointed a day. Sorry, it's in the King James. Come on. Because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed, and of this he has given assurance to all men by raising him from the dead. So here he's talking about God, and then he says, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man. So even in the resurrected state, Paul's referring to the resurrected Jesus as a man and not as God, as Trinitarian Christians are so eager to do. As if the creator of the universe somehow wasn't sufficient, that he wasn't able to get through to the Gentiles of the world unless he took the form of a man. And then somehow that it was able to get through to their thick skulls. So we finished with Deuteronomy chapter 18. So we now have two cases where a prophet is false. And I'm not sure that these are all of the cases, but these are two that will rule out most of the Gentile prophets who like to pop up from time to time, pretending to be the real ambassadors, emissaries, and messengers of the creator of the universe. Moreover, to the children of Israel. So it's not just presuming to be a messenger from the creator of the universe to Gentiles, but also to the creator of the universe. In fact, or to the children of Israel. In fact, we actually have three things here. One, if they do a sign or a wonder, or if they speak something that does come to pass, yet they try to promote gods that the children of Israel did not know when they had left Egypt. Two, if it's a prophet that is not of the brothers of the children of Israel, so in other words, he's not of the children of Israel, that's another disqualifier that points to his being a false prophet. I'm looking at you, Muhammad. And then three, if he says something that's supposed to come to pass and it doesn't come to pass, then you shall not fear that prophet. Why? Because he's a false prophet. Now, what happens with these prophecies? Okay, here you have the plain meaning, then you have something called pesher, which I'll just say that this is like a contemporaneous application. And then you have pesher, but it's untestable, and then you have future predictions that are, or predictions that are applied that just aren't testable at all. Here you have the prophet, and at the time that he speaks, what he says applies probably in his lifetime. That's how most of the prophecies that the prophets give in the Hebrew Tanakh, they primarily apply to the people that lived at that time that the prophets spoke or wrote. They were the ones that had the ears to hear or the eyes to see the text. And what the prophets spoke was most relevant to them. And as we saw in Deuteronomy chapter 18, it was because the children of Israel wanted to hear from God. They wanted to know what was going on in the world and how it might have a bearing upon them, So the Creator provided them a prophet like Moses in their generation to speak to them and let them know what was going on. Now, those generations lived and died, they passed away, new generations came along. Now those words, either spoken verbally by the prophet or written down by the prophet, the question arises, well, how are those words of benefit to a later generation? Now, obviously, there are some things that a prophet could say which would be universally applicable, right, to any generation. And it's pretty easy to apply those to any generation. But then there might be specifics, and you have to wonder, well, why are we preserving these words? How are they relevant to me in my later generation? Well, this is where this, what some call the Pesher technique of scriptural interpretation, comes along. And we see this in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'm not sure if this is the proper term for it, really, but we'll just call it contemporaneous application or contemporary application of obviously past prophecies. So this method of interpretation takes words that are very specific to the circumstances of a past generation and applies them to the circumstances of the currently living generation. And I mean, it's pretty much accepted that this is okay to do. I would submit that the way past prophecy is applied to a living generation cannot contradict the original plain meaning. Otherwise, you are putting words into the mouth of that prophet that he did not say, and you risk damaging that prophet's reputation through your perverted interpretation. I think it was Rabbi Emmanuel Shochet in his one of his videos, I think it was What the World Doesn't Know About the Messiah, or it may have been a video series. He says, you know, what the prophets that came after Moses, what they said, they didn't really add much. Mostly they exhorted the people to follow Moses. They may have predicted something that was going to happen, but it wasn't like they were bringing some new religion or some new innovation to the children of Israel in their Torah lifestyle. So in Judaism, not as much importance is placed on the later prophets, because I think it's somewhat understood that these later prophets were speaking to specific generations, and that it's Moses who's the prophet that's really important. Because if you go to the end of Deuteronomy, and this is how it is in Judaism, by the way. A second, go here and then back one. And that is that the halacha is, I think, supremely important. And the halacha is the commandments and how you are to fulfill the commandments as received by the Jewish community by the children of Israel. It's accepted by the children of Israel that this is how you fulfill this specific commandment. And that's why people who are Gentiles, who have their own special little interpretations of the commandments of the Torah, or say heretics like the Karaites, their opinions don't matter because they're not representative of the Jewish community at large, the children of Israel at large. The children of Israel, through their observance and how they receive a given opinion on how to observe a certain commandment, they essentially, they're the custodians and stewards of the Torah, and they're really the ones with the authority to instruct others on how the Torah is to be observed. That is the, as the Torah says, that is the responsibility of the elders and the priests to expound upon the written Torah as it is read. Later, as is suggested, I think that the priesthood was corrupted, possibly by some Gentile influence, maybe where the high priests may have been chosen or appointed by Gentile powers. I'm not sure. That it became the case that the Pharisees, because they were just more knowledgeable about the Torah, the Pharisees gained a place where they were in the position to instruct the priests on what needed to be done, say, for example, in certain temple rituals, just because they had studied the matter more than some of the priests at that time. So now a Pharisee who's, say, a rabbi, he can't officiate as a priest if he's not one of the priests. But he can instruct a priest on what the priest is supposed to do. And that's why the Pharisees came to be so well known, and also because in the first century, when the Romans were occupying the area and carrying out the war against the Jews, it was the Pharisees, contrary to the picture provided by the Christian addendum, it was the Pharisees who were the glue. They were the moderates, the glue of the Jewish community. They were holding the Jewish community together when the Romans were practicing their divide and conquer strategy against the Jews by creating both very backslidden or libertine, is that the word? Or maybe liberal forms of Judaism, maybe that allowed foreigners into their number, or took very lenient interpretations of commandments. So you had that extreme at one end, and then you had these super zealous extremes at the other end, which, according to my reading of at least some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, I think the Dead Sea Scrolls fits that description pretty well, because I don't know if there were zealot elements in the Dead Sea Scrolls community, but certainly some of their ideas about how they ran their community were much more extreme than the Pharisees are painted as being in the Christian addendum. So rather than the Pharisees being the what's the word, extremists in the Jewish community, I think it was the Dead Sea Scrolls community, at least in some of the scrolls. I'm not sure if all of the scrolls are truly attributed to the Dead Sea Scrolls community or not. But I'm talking about like the community rule. In the community rule, man, they got some rules, and I have a past of being involved in some very strict quasi-Christian denominations, or what some term cults, and the rules in the community rule make those cults look like child's play. So I really think that at least the people behind the writing of at least some of the Dead Sea Scrolls were the real extremists. And I also am of the suspicion that the Romans were behind some of these extremist cults. I also think the Romans were behind some of the zealot activity in the first century, because the Romans had both military spies and scouts, and in the Christian scriptures, you also get the impression that Jesus / Titus Flavius actually engages in some scouting or spying activity, where he actually goes to towns or cities before they're actually bringing, say, the rest of his apostles there, right? And his apostles are just his messengers, his lieutenants, his sent out ones. Apostle means sent out one, or an ambassador or an emissary, but sent out one is also a very good translation of scout. So these apostles may have actually just been scouts for Titus Flavius. And I think that Joseph Atwill says as much in his book Caesar's Messiah. Anyway, again, went off on a tangent. What was I saying? Oh, so yeah, I think that the Romans were behind some of that zealot activity. You could say they may have been controlled opposition, providing the justification to kick off the war, right? You could see armies doing this still to this day. They can dress people up in the garb of their enemies, have those false flag operatives do things against them that would then justify them to react with overwhelming force. Rome, it's known that Rome would engage in the divide and conquer strategy. How would you divide and conquer the Jewish people? They're a religious people. Well, then you have to aim at their religion. And that's where you get one end of the extreme. By creating Christianity, you're creating this uber liberal, anti-Torah, anomian version, counterfeit, mockery of Judaism. So that if you have perhaps some less educated Jews on the fringes, they may gravitate to those liberal ideas. Whereas if you have some zealous, very committed, very educated Jews who maybe see some verses in the Torah that they think aren't really being observed well enough by the Jewish community, they may gravitate to an extremist form of Judaism because they're observing those commandments the way they think they should be observed. And what happens? You're tearing the Jewish community in two as the community becomes polarized between these two extremes. But the rabbis, not stupid men, they were the glue holding the Jewish community together. And that's why the Christian scriptures has to target the Pharisees, because despite Rome's attempts to tear the Jewish community in two, the rabbis, the Pharisees, were holding it together. So they had to demonize the Pharisees in the Christian scriptures, because the rabbis that exist to this very day are descendants of the Pharisees. That's why Christianity is an attack on Judaism and the Jewish people. And people who try to apologize for Christianity and say that it's not, they're not very educated. I submit that they don't know the history of the first century very well, and they should get more educated. Because here I am, just a dumb Gentile, and I know this better than these super learned seminarians, graduates of seminaries, who think that they know so much, and who are trying to apologize for this whoredom called Christianity. But let's continue. Back to our graphic. So we'll see these prophecies applied to the living generation. And by the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and even the Christian scriptures, and even the Mishnah, and later on in the Talmud, this is accepted practice. But again, I say, this is my personal opinion, if those applications are contrary to the plain meaning of the words provided to the by the prophet, or through the prophet from the Creator to the generation living in his time, then I would put my trust in the plain meaning rather than the contradictory interpretation. Now, sometimes the way these prophecies are applied to the living generation, it is done in a way that the verse is predicting some event that hasn't happened, and that is sometime in the future. This is an untestable prophecy. So that means that we now cannot test whether this prophet is a true prophet according to one of the tests of a prophet in Deuteronomy, I think it was 18. Because it doesn't look like it's going to happen in our time, and the prediction appears to be for some future time. Like, you know, the in my opinion, the flawed translation of end times or last days, when really the term, as in Hebrew, to me it appears to mean just later on, or just later days, like really how it's translated by some as latter days. Latter days means later days. It's just not today, later days. I don't know, is there even a word in Hebrew for tomorrow? I'd have to look that up. But it just seems to be the Hebrew way to say, in the future. In the future, this is going to happen. Okay, well, the future could be like 5 minutes after the prophecy is completed. Or it could be so far out that it's not a testable prophecy. But why would they be giving prophecies that can't be tested? that would be a suspicious prophet. If he's giving you a prophecy, say there's the residents of Tel Aviv in this day. If there was a living prophet in this day, maybe there is, maybe there isn't, I don't know. And the people in Tel Aviv are very concerned because rockets are being fired into Tel Aviv, and it's killing a horrendous amount of Israelis in Tel Aviv. So the people, maybe not so much these days, because like the Jewish community these days, they don't really expect a prophet in their day, even though the Torah promises them one. And that's because of various reasons. Personally, I think it's flawed, because it's the same thing happens in Christianity. Is like after the first century, these people, they're basically telling the Creator to shut up. And they're saying, oh, because this and that, the conduit of heaven has been shut, and there's no prophecy in our time. How can you tell the Creator to shut up? He's already promised that he can speak to you through the words of living prophet. So, but it's because of programming that seems like the Jewish community these days doesn't expect a prophet in their generation. They do, however, expect the eschatological Messiah, or the true Messiah, in their generation. So maybe in that respect they are expecting a prophet to come. But it's not Jesus. For various reasons, Jesus, for one, doesn't fulfill lots of the requirements of the eschatological Messiah, where a model of the eschatological Messiah has been provided in Cyrus the Great of Persia, who the prophet Isaiah calls Messiah by name, when he can't seem to do that for Jesus. Possibly because Jesus is an impossibility in Hebrew, so how could he? But anyway, so you have these prophecies, and they're aimed for some future time. Christians believe the end times or the last days, whereas Torah is really a religion about day after day observance, and not about maxing out your credit cards because you expect the world to end tomorrow. So a prophecy that can't be tested would give a very suspicious person a chance to receive all the glory and respect of a prophet, but never be exposed as a false prophet. And yet, it's just this sort of interpretation of the scriptural passages in the Hebrew Tanakh that makes up many of the so-called messianic proof texts, or messianic claims or proofs of Jesus being the Messiah. And it also points to the fact that Jesus failed to fulfill many of the things expected of the Messiah. And so you have this expectation of a second coming. And the Christian scriptures have Jesus himself predicting this second coming. according to the interpretations of some, which have been received almost universally by Christendom, we'll call them, the whole, Christianity in all of its forms, albeit there are some that don't. And that is this expectation of a second coming that hasn't happened yet, prophesied by Jesus himself. So it's not a testable prophecy, and yet generations of Christians live and die, and this prophecy, this thing that was spoken, does not come to pass, and yet Christians go on fearing him. They go on fearing this false prophet, who issued this prophecy that did not come to pass. Now there is a more literal explanation of this prophecy issued by Jesus, which we know Jesus is Titus Flavius, and that is that Titus Flavius did come later on in 69, 70 CE with the Roman legions, and they did fulfill that passage. But the church, Christianity, is so expectant of the second coming that they completely fail to see that Titus and his legions fulfilled that prophecy. Now you might say, well, if Titus and his legions fulfilled that prophecy and Jesus is Titus, then Titus predicted his own fulfillment of that prophecy, so he must be a true prophet. No, because what was that? Was it Matthew that has the little apocalypse? Anyway, it doesn't matter, because three of the Gospels came into existence around roughly the same time, and then supposedly the Gospel of John came along later. And the prophecy we're talking about, the Christian prophecy, the text itself is dated to roughly around the time when Titus and his legions came. It is not dated by educated scholars to the years in which Jesus is supposed to have said that. So even though he supposedly verbally said it back in 33 CE, scholars seem to recognize that the text itself did not exist before, at the earliest, I think, 65 CE. So what does that mean? It means that Titus backdated this prophecy. He put this prophecy in the mouth of Jesus, this literary disguise for himself, so that prophecy would how do I even say this? This is the kind of gymnastics their propaganda has engaged in. The events predicted already transpired, so the prophecy is backdated so that it appears to have already come to pass. With the readers of that text, which the readers of that text would likely have been after the destruction of the temple. So then it appears that Jesus is a true prophet because what he predicted came to pass. But it's a problem for Christianity because a lot of the requirements of the eschatological Messiah haven't been fulfilled. For one, Jesus is dead. He's absent. That's certainly not like any of the other Jewish messiahs, Moshiachs, whether they were kings or high priests of Israel, those men were present in their day and age. They weren't absent. Jesus is tardy. He's so many dates have expectations, expected dates, and they like to say, oh, no man knows the day or the hour. Well, that's an untestable prophecy, and that's exactly what you would want a suspicious false prophet to say, because he can't be tested if no man knows the day or the hour, and you didn't bother to tell us what the day or the hour was. And that's why Christianity is like this girl who's been stood up on a date, who hour by hour is still standing there waiting for her false Messiah to show up, because they've been given a prophecy that can't be tested. So, there you have it, really. You take prophecies that were given and came to pass with the people of the time that they were given, and then you interpret those passages in ways that can never be tested, because you believe that these things are for the future. So how can we test that prophet? If the prophecy is so far in the future that it can't be tested, how can we know that that person is a true prophet or not? Well, fortunately, we have these other requirements of a true prophet. Namely, he has to be one of the children of Israel, not a Roman emperor like Jesus, and he can't promote the worship of deities that the children of Israel did not know at the time that they had left Egypt, which is exactly what Jesus is. So I'm just going to leave it right there. The Torah gave us the instructions on how to know whether someone was a true prophet or not. If Jesus gave prophecies that could not be tested, then he was certainly suspicious. If he spoke prophecies that had not come to pass, then he's a false prophet, and I would submit at the same time a false Messiah. If he promoted the worship of some deity that was not known by the name of the deity that led the children of Israel out of Egypt, then he's a promoter of false gods, and the Torah has very strong words against that person. So what am I saying? This little Gentile here is telling you, wake up. The Christian church, century after century, has been hanging on this untestable prophecy, never able to prove that this was a false prophet. And it is distracting them from expecting something real and serving the deity of the Bible, the one that the children of Israel knew after they had been led out of Egypt. Just my 2 cents. It just aggravates me when I see Israelis and Jews living in Israel falling for these ignoramus Christian evangelists. And it just shocks me that any Jew could be so poorly educated about the Torah that they could fall for that message when it's a prophecy that can't be tested, coming from a prophet who can't be tested.